Hi, welcome back, everybody. I'm Harley Thrance. It looks like we have most of the participants back. In fact, we continue to increase the number of participants. So thanks very much. We will begin the second part of our presentation with Jeremy Scheel, and he is the co-founder and chief marketing officer and longtime advocate, bless your heart, for the Space Frontier Foundation. Jeremy, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Next slide. All right, so just Jeremy Scheel, co-founder, chief development officer of Orbit Fab. I also sit as vice chair of CONFERS. So firstly, thank you everyone for taking time out of your week to spend 2 days with us during the annual GSSF conference. Really appreciate all your support. So next slide. So Orbit Fab, our vision is to help enable a bustling in-space economy. If we truly want people to go beyond Earth, we are going to need servicing, tourism, a bunch of other things. And we believe that fuel is the bedrock for this bustling economy. So we provide fuel in LEO, GEO, and cislunar space, mainly storable propellants like hydrazine, xenon, high-test peroxide, and water. Next slide. And so in today's market, we lose about $10 billion in value in each year. And that's mainly because we have no flexibility. And you can hit next 4 times here to get those photos. But what we're all doing here at CONFERS and at GSSF really is unlocking this flexibility, right? Like Northrop Grumman with their MEV docking to the Intelsat satellites, giving them an extra life. What Astroscale is doing with debris removal. Like so many of us here are working to take that next step in the space industry. But the problem is that we still are in this paradigm where we all have one tank of gas, essentially. You launch with all of your fuel. But there's some good news. So next slide. When we started Orbit Fab back in 2018, there were only 8 satellite servicing companies that we identified. And as of now, there are over 100 satellite servicing companies globally working to remove debris, to provide that jetpack, to provide last mile orbit insertion, LEO to GEO tugs, and a bunch of other things that are really going to help propel the industry forward, giving it that flexibility. And this year with Northrop Grumman docking MEV2, that was our first transition from a space economy, which was primarily Earth observation and communications, to an in-space economy where goods and services are being exchanged for a service in space. So it's a huge shift that has happened this year. And you can see it in the DoD and everywhere else around the world where people are actively looking at servicing, deorbiting, and everything else that will help make this industry grow. So next slide. So as I said earlier, and you can hit 4 on this one as well. As I said earlier, it's great that we're doing all of this servicing, but we're still in that single-use paradigm. Airplanes, a single 747 will refuel about 40,000 times over its 20-year life. Your car about 750 times over a 10-year life, and SpaceX hitting their milestone this year for 10 refuels on a single booster. So we're moving in the right direction, but unfortunately, satellites are still in the no refuel, which is where we come in. Right. So next slide. So we supply the fuel. So we sell a fluid interface that we call RAFTI. It's a drop-in replacement for a fill and drain valve, and I'll talk more about that later. But essentially, we have our customers fly our service valve, and we can provide them with the fuel. If you hit next, long term, and what they can do is now go and service more customers with a single asset instead of launching a new asset every time they run out. Next slide. Long term, we want to have every spacecraft equipped with RAFTI so that our partners and us can go and refuel them when they need it, allowing for greater delta V augmentation and everything else in this industry. And so next slide. And so we supply the fuel. So here is our first render of our GEO jump, our GEO fuel depot that will be launching end of next year. And so this will have hydrazine in it, and will be available for anybody who wants it. Next slide. And so to access our refueling network, we have Rafty. And here you can see it's Rafty is being shown on our Tenzing spacecraft, which launched June of this year. So this spacecraft contains high test peroxide, but Rafty, surrounded by 4 fiducials here, really allows us to work towards cooperative and fully prepared docking to really drive down the cost of our refueling service. And so, the size here, it fits in the palm of your hand. So nice and small. We also have a Block 2, which is being qualified under an Air Force contract for the Air Force. And this is rated for GEO, and this is the actual size. And then you'll have a few fiducials around this. Next slide. So this is our test setup in our lab. You can see we have the active side and the service side. Active side on the right, service side on the left, and they are on top of 2 of our air-bearing float units. So we have our air-bearing table allowing us to simulate and test our contact dynamics. So if you go to the next slide, a short video will play of that. So as you see, the arms will slowly wrap around, allowing it to fix its misalignment, and the fingers come in slowly. This also helps to make sure that it's coming in. As you see, it's going 2 times speed now. And then once it gets closer, the satellites will then fix the alignment. And once we have full connection and we make and we have our pins that say that we're fully connected, we pass the fuel. And then when we're done, we release the fuel. We release the client spacecraft. The next slide. And under a National Science Foundation grant, we started working on RPOD preliminary, just to make sure that we can fully simulate cooperative docking. So this is all done in our lab, and we're still continuing this work today. So next slide. So some of our big milestones, we founded the company in 2018, and within a year, we launched to the International Space Station with our FERFI mission. So you have the rigid tanker here on the right, which was brought up with 3 gallons of water, and then our flexible tank on the left. And that flex tank, the idea is you stow a flexible tank in a 4-unit volume. And when you refuel on orbit, you could take up to 100 kilos of fuel, giving you ridiculous delta V to do some interesting missions. And at the end of that successful mission on the ISS, we actually hooked up to the ISS water supply. We became the first private company to supply water to the International Space Station. Next slide. And so exciting for this year was we launched Tenzing, so the world's first commercial fuel depot. So this was a huge effort. We basically handed it over within 6 months and launched after 9 months from starting the program. So this is currently in SunSync. Again, it's got 2 Rafties. It has all of the fiducials and LED light indicators, so it can be docked to if needed. And we kind of look at this as our orbital lab. This was in partnership with Scout and a few other servicing companies to really be an orbital test bed for us. And as you see here on the bottom, that's the Tenzing deploying from the Transporter 2 mission. Next slide. And so what's next? So we're working on our demo mission in LEO for the end of next year, early 2023. We'll take 2 of our fuel shuttles, put them in a low LEO, dock them together, and transfer fuel, and do that as many times as we can. Additionally, we also have our GEO jump, our GEO depot that's launching at the end of 2022, early 23 as well, in partnership with Spaceflight. And we're working on multiple fuel contracts as well. So a lot of exciting things going on here, and looking forward to working with all of you. Next slide. I'm just going to run through these next slides pretty fast since I know we're at time. Next slide. Okay, back 1 slide real fast, sorry. So just wanted to say one more exciting piece of news that happened today, that happened this year, was we closed a convertible note, notably to bring in Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman, who both invested in us for our refueling technology. This is an industry first, so really happy to have them as our partners and working with them to really grow this servicing ecosystem. We're also trusted by a bunch of companies here, as you can see, and really couldn't have done it without our team on the next slide. So we have Daniel Faber, our co-founder, CEO. Yep. So thanks, everyone. I know we're out of time here.
Well, Jeremy, thank you so much. Thank you. That's terrific. And let me note to you and to all of the presenters, please take a look at on your own. Please take a look at the Q&A. They'll be erased at the end of the end of every session or so. There are a number of folks who are asking questions, and they also give contact information if you desire to get in contact with them to answer their questions. All right. So, Jeremy, thank you.
Thank you.
And we have, so next up will be Pam Melroy, who's the Deputy Administrator, of course, at NASA. And well, I guess I can, Fred, you're there. You get the distinct and high honor of introducing our next presenter, Pam Melroy.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Fred Flane, and I'm the Executive Director of the Space Infrastructure Foundation. Our vision, shared with many, is for the development of space capabilities for the benefit of all humanity and the world. In support of this common vision, Space Infrastructure Foundation is a leader in the advocacy, education, and action in the development of open technical standards for space. Serving as a standards architect for CONFERS, we interact with the on-orbit servicing community across the supply chain to engage professional, national, and international voluntary consensus standards development organizations. Pamela Melroy was sworn in as the NASA Deputy Administrator in June of 2021. She holds degrees in physics and astronomy from Wellesley College, and Earth and Planetary Sciences from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Commissioned in the Air Force in 1983. In June of 1991, she attended the Air Force Test Pilot School, and upon her graduation, served as a test pilot until her selection for the astronaut program in 1994. She has logged more than 6,000 flight hours in more than 50 different aircraft. As an astronaut, she has logged more than 38 days, 924 hours, in space. She served as a pilot on 2 flights and was the mission commander on STS-120. Most appropriately for the GSSF conference this year, all 3 of her missions were assembly missions to build the International Space Station. After serving in the Air Force and as an astronaut, Deputy Administrator Melroy took on a number of different leadership positions, including in the FAA and at DARPA. We may note here that it was a DARPA vision that created the Consortium for the Execution of Rendezvous and Servicing Operations, CONFERS, and the GSSF. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor to present to you NASA Deputy Administrator Pam Melroy.
Thank you, Frederick. And Pam, let me a quick note for the participants. Pam has agreed to take questions at the end, so use the Q&A box to ask her questions. So again, apologies, Pam.
Oh, absolutely. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that introduction, Fred, and I am especially happy because I actually formulated CONFERS when I was at DARPA, and I'm just thrilled to see that you have convened this group, and I'm very happy to address you. I'd like to talk about a couple of topics. I'll start out with standards because it's very important to me. In fact, when I was formulating CONFERS, I was really thinking about flexibility and the power of standards for the future. As a regulator at the FAA, I saw how difficult and lengthy it was to change a regulation. In particular, even if you were trying to make something easier, it took just as long and was as difficult. But what I saw from the aviation side of the FAA is that the use of standards enabled a much greater level of flexibility. Would be able to say the intent of a performance-based regulation would be met if you followed a standard. Now, standards still take time to negotiate, but it is much less difficult than to actually get a new regulation or even a changed regulation across the finish line. So at the time, I forecasted, unfortunately, somewhat accurately, that it was going to take time for the government to organize around an on-orbit oversight authority. And looking out ahead at the DARPA program, robotic servicing of geo satellites, my concern was that it would be bound up in some of these challenges that we see with policy and regulatory oversight. Now it looks like we're going forward. Thanks to our partners at Northrop Grumman who've led the way with MEV. But I still believe very strongly that industry and government together can develop standards that are consensus-based, performance-based, based on safety, that would enable the growth of the industry. In particular, on-orbit servicing, assembly, and manufacturing are stressing cases for space traffic management, as well as other policy concerns such as orbital debris, norms of behavior, liability under the Outer Space Treaty, etc. So as the industry is developing, government and industry have to move quickly. And for me, quickly meant standards. So commercial OSAM capabilities, missions and programs currently span the globe. So common standards are going to be crucial to ensuring the long-term success and cooperation in space. Standards in space will allow a range of OSAM technologies to work seamlessly, provide a common language to measure and evaluate performance, make interoperability of components made by different organizations possible, protect the space environment, and of course, create positive norms around space sustainability. I just want to point out that NASA has a very strong role in leading the way in establishing standards. NASA's Technical Standards Program is sponsored by the NASA Chief Engineer, and its primary mission is to enhance the agency's engineering capabilities by supporting NASA participation in the development of voluntary consensus standards. One of my favorite examples is the International Docking System Standard. So if you look at the International Space Station, it's a partnership between 5 space agencies in 15 countries. We could not have assembled this giant platform in space without interoperability and interfacing standards. NASA has even developed standards for berthing future spacecraft to the ISS in consultation with our international partners, but this will allow many more spacecraft to visit the station in the future. NASA helped found and is the chair of the Consultative Committee for Space Data Systems, or CCSDS, which is a multinational forum for the development of communications and data system standards for spaceflight. And to date, well over 500 missions have used CCSDS standards. NASA, in consultation with other nations, has also developed deep space interoperability standards. These standards were prepared with the goal of defining interfaces and environments to facilitate cooperative deep space exploration endeavors. And of course, other countries have recognized the importance of standards, such as Germany's DLR-led IBOS, which is a modular approach toward enhanced future space systems. Now, NASA is a leader in OSAM, as well as DoD and other agencies, and we're laying the groundwork to nurture capabilities that can enable missions, such as the assembly of large telescopes in space that no longer need to be constrained by the launching rocket's fairing size. Even ideas such as persistent platforms in space designed for modular instrument replacement and upgrade, not to mention sustainable lunar exploration, where we'll finally learn to live off the land. The formulation of CONFERS was oriented towards understanding that we need standards in key areas, rendezvous and proximity operations. There have been tremendous progress in this area, and our commercial partners are racing and developing all kinds of interesting business models that rely on RPO. Now, we still have some work to do. Standards for grappling satellites, for example, not just for servicing, but also for assembly, are still needed. Refuelability and propellant depots in space. Industry members are beginning to make their buses refuelable, and there are companies out there that are aiming to provide propellant in space. There's a lot of exciting developments underway in this area as well. Space-based manufacturing. Manufacturing in space is not going to be feasible without greater efforts in standardization. It's really a nascent area, and how to do it fully autonomously is still a challenge. So whether and how quickly we need to develop standards in manufacturing, let's be fair, it's still being debated. On the ISS, efforts at standardization, such as cleanliness, sharp edges, and other technical standards, have made it more expensive to do process development and new capabilities. And at the same time, China has been offering to provide access to their station free or at cost and impose no standards. I acknowledge that there's a legitimate tension between competing and collaborating, which is why some private companies aren't quite ready to agree to develop standards in space-based manufacturing. But I think we have to remember we have to grow the pie before we can begin to divide it. So to continue along the theme of what the gaps in standards are that need to be addressed, I think we have a lot in the area of grasping, manipulating, modifying, repair, refuel, and build completely new platforms in spacecraft. Standards will help enable new business models, innovations, and opportunities. The lack of clear and widely accepted technical and safety standards for responsible performance is still a major obstacle to satellite servicing, assembly, and manufacturing. If done improperly, it could lead to issues that would put the long-term sustainability of space at risk, not to mention putting us right back where we were when building and launching rockets and building spacecraft was a handmade, one-off, artisanal process. This is not the way to grow an industry. I'm going to repeat a point I just made. There was a tremendous effort made around standards in microelectronics, and the key concept was to collaborate to compete. Collaborate to compete. We have to collaborate today. We can grow the pie, and then people can compete for pieces of the pie later on. And there are many areas beyond OSAM where we need standards. For example, interoperability infrastructure standards for operating on and around the moon. With the large and complex problems we have set out to solve, we need to set the standard. How do you plug in? How do you provide water, power, etc.? Here's another one. What is the definition and the standards around sustainable extraction of resources for ISRU on the moon and Mars? Networking standards. We already know that existing networking protocol is inadequate for deep space networking because the physics are different. We need delay tolerant networking for solar system internet, and we need to be working those standards right now. And remember, the standards aren't just technical. We need standards for other areas too. For example, liability. So there's inherent risk in OSAM activities, and it can be very high. So we can set our goals on a technological level to limit the risk, but how do we share that risk in an equitable way? And how about contract standards? For example, if you contract to fix and service a satellite and the problem is made worse, orbital debris is created, perhaps there's damage done, who is responsible? We should have some standards around that sharing of risk and liability. There's a lot we can learn from other communities. For example, NASA sponsors a Lunar Surface Innovation Consortium to harness the creativity, energy, and resources of the nation to extend the frontiers of lunar exploration. Can the OSAM community be building some consortium like that to grow their community? CubeSats are a classic example of standardized satellite manufacturing and launch, and they've revolutionized the space sector. What are the lessons there that we should be taking away? And there are other examples outside space, some of which we actually take for granted. I mentioned microelectronics, Semitech, that led to a huge boom in the creation of really high quality, low cost chips that led to the computer and then the smartphone revolution. And think about where we would be if we didn't have a standard for USB connections and the tools that we take for granted just about every day. So I'm asking for CONFERS to coordinate strategy and investment of OSAM capability development and infusion. Identify, organize, and collaborate on OSAM activities with different organizations within NASA and other government agencies, as well as industry and academia. Build a community. Identify cross-cutting applications and collaborative opportunities, and that will help develop a robust OSAM ecosystem. And advocate for policy guidance around OSAM-related in-space and surface norms of behavior, specifically understanding implications and threats of fully realized OSAM capabilities. Building a community will support coordinated investment decisions across all of our partners, venture capital, equity, and government, to collectively advance the OSAM suite of capabilities, especially as we develop a robust economy in LEO and as we explore further out than ever before. We hope to engage the wide-ranging global spaceflight industry and encourage feedback on the standards from all potential stakeholder audiences. Thank you, and I'm happy to take a few questions.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Pam. We've got a few minutes for a few questions. There are a number of questions which I think your presentation went a long way to answer. A lot of questions about what's the best way for private industry, for commercial interest to engage with NASA, but you spoke to that. I'm going to be a little bit more specific and go with a question that Fred Slane asked. Paul Gill is the NASA Technical Standards Program Office Director. What is his role in connecting an open, voluntary consensus standard base? How could Paul best help to connect industry and NASA, subject matter experts, and sort of long-range thinking that you described briefly?
So Paul is indeed responsible for this area and is doing a lot of these activities in other areas. It really, we don't have a direct focus in this area. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to bring it up to CONFERS, because it was part of the original formulation of CONFERS. But I can follow up with Paul and see if he's got any suggestions. I'll take that action.
It sounds fine. You may be tripling or quadrupling Paul's email list by that. So let's see. I have a question that came up earlier in one of the earlier presentations, and that is folks are talking about recycling in space and assembly in space and so on and so forth. Obviously, that's one of the goals of this conference. What thinking has NASA, or the folks that you work with, what thinking has gone into the eventual end of life for ISS? I mean, eventually it'll come to an end. So is there thought about disassembly, reuse, recovery, recycling, that sort of thing?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. Actually, I can just say that we have had several expressions of interest from industry partners about maximizing that very thing. It's perfectly logical and it makes a lot of sense. I will say it was an interesting experience to assemble while we flew the space station. If you stop and think about some of the things we had to do, every time we added a new element, we had to upload all new software because, of course, the mass properties had changed. And in some cases, had to upload whole new instantiations of control software. So thinking through very carefully how you continue to fly safely while you're taking yourself apart is going to be an interesting exercise. But I think we would clearly want to make sure that we provided the maximum opportunities for follow-on commercial space stations in LEO.
Where disassembly would be at least as challenging as assembly. So I think you've got a lot of folks who are willing to help out. Okay. Thank you so much. That brings us up to 11 o'clock. It was a terrific presentation, and we look forward to seeing this, or the conference looks forward to seeing many of the things that you talked about today come to fruition over the next several years. So. Thank
you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
All right. So we're going to go straight to our next presentation by let's see. Fushigi-san. He is the Director for Space Security and National Space Policy in the Secretary of the Cabinet Office, and he's going to be speaking on Japan's draft requirements for a license to operate a spacecraft performing on-orbit servicing. Very, very germane to our workshop. So looking forward to it. You have the floor.
Okay, can I start? Yep. So good morning, everyone. So I'm talking about Japan draft requirements for a license to perform orbit servicing. Next, please. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah. So orbit servicing is one of the area of greatest international interest, and many entities are exploring possible standards for acceptable OS performance. In Japan, JAXA and Astroscale will jointly conduct phase 1 mission of the commercial removal of debris demonstration project next year. So as to prepare for its mission license application, the government of Japan established a study group last December. The study group consisted of practitioners from both the government and industries, as well as academics and specialists as shown on the slide. The study group released a report accompanied by a recommended set of supplementary requirements for orbit servicing May this year. Next. The most important thing to keep in mind when making a rule for WOS is the fact that a servicer spacecraft has considerable potential to pose a threat of harmful interference in comparison with a conventional spacecraft. Next. Next, please. Here. A servicer is supposed to perform maneuvers more frequently in a larger scale, and hence it could bring about a greater risk of conjunction. Next. Moreover, the servicer's capabilities of executing the service can be used for malicious purpose as well. Next. An WOS provider or its contracted operator takes direct responsibility for these risks. But Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty stipulated state parties' responsibility for activities by such non-governmental entities. Next. Therefore, the NSPS must prepare detailed requirements to ensure any WOS is carried out responsibly under governmental supervision. Next. However, it is not so easy to define responsible WOS performance. Indeed, how can WOS be performed responsibly? The slide shows some typical forms of WOS, categorized according to its effects on a client or target object. The bottom one, namely remote SSA performed on orbit, has conceptually no effect on a client. Next. While the second bot could interrupt the client and constrain its operation discretion. Next. Thirdly, repairing, replacing parts of, or refueling a client would undoubtedly intervene in its operation because the service of spacecraft must capture or be connected to the client to conduct such tasks. Next. Fourthly, by executing ADR, mission extension, or upgrading, the servicer would inevitably change client's architecture and or its mission. Next. Finally, and hypothetically speaking, we can imagine a form of WOS exposing a client by means of destruction, although this method hardly conforms with international norms. Next. The performance of WOS has influence not only on the client, but also on the third-party space object. In particular, there are risks of conjunction with a maneuvering servicer and that with debris generated during the service. Next. Thus, considering that mission-generated debris could pose risks to third parties, responsible WOS must not reach a protected orbital region with any dangerous disposals. Next. Accordingly, one objective of licensing criteria is to ensure the safety of WOS methodology with credibility reinforced by transparency. Next. More precisely. The objective is to ensure methodology, not leaving disposals, and service architecture and its operation plan, preventing a collision and breaking up of both the servicer and client. Next. Behavior similar to the performance of WS can be observed in different types of activities. For example, the capabilities of WS can be used for aggression and harassment. Next, protection of friendly spacecraft and self-defense, and the testing and the demonstration of such military usages. Next. These WS-like activities can be grouped according to consent to the operation by a right holder with a client object. WS is undoubtedly performed based on the consent by a client, and testing and demonstration are provided basically for testing entities on mock targets, while it is apparent that the other activities cannot be consented. Next. They are also divided according to the basic characteristics of the relation with the client target object as shown on the slide. So back to the licensing criteria issue, the another objective is to distinguish WS credibly and transparently from military usage with above detailed dividing factors in mind. In other words, the other objective of licensing criteria is to ensure the justifiability of WS purposes as responsibility activities, with credibility reinforced by transparency. Next, to this end, requirements regarding this objective must stipulate procedures to make WS a consented lawful civil service. Next. In light of the above objectives, the study group identified and recommended the safety requirements as shown on the slide. Mr. Toru Yoshihara, the director of JAXA's System Safety Unit, is going to elaborate each safety requirements and its reasons at the technical working group meeting in November, so I'll skip them today. Next. As for the justifiability of purposes, there are two types of requirements. One is on relations with the owner or operator of the client object. Next. And the other is that with its state of registry. Next. The former is a contract with or consent from the right holder. Next. And the latter is obedience to the regulations by the state of registry and notification thereto. The study group suggests that the client party should be contracted to apply for an approval for or report on prospective changes in the client's original architecture or operation plan brought by WS, if necessary. Next. The study group and NSPS are convinced that transparency is the key to making the technical safety and the justifiability of purposes credible to third-party operators, and thus to relieving their sense of insecurity. There are three objectives under the goal of transparency to facilitate the aforesaid credibility. The first and second objectives are to provide third parties with potential evidence for assessing Japan's accredited safety and justifiability as credible with a certain level of confidence. Next. The third objective is to enable third-party operators to plan and conduct collision avoidance by giving them an opportunity to obtain information about potential conjunction from a certain SSA organization. Next. Next, please. To achieve these objectives, both the government and licensed licensees should take their respective responsibilities. The government is required to publish official WS guidelines, first of all. Next, okay. And then on licensing a respective WS mission, the government should announce main features of the mission and inform the UN user of them to request dissemination thereof. Next. So the next, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. The government is also required to prepare for appropriate international consultation. As for licensees, it is required to report mission details to the government and make a public release about the main features of the licensed mission. Next. Licensee is also required to report or share ephemeris and maneuver information to the official SSA organization designated by the government. By doing this, the licensee can enable third-party operators to acquire data messages on potential conjunction. In addition, the draft requirements prescribes that a licensee should report to the government and announce necessary information on anomalies and or failures with potentially harmful interference. So NSPACE is now conferring with stakeholders to authorize the study group's draft and will publish new official WS guidelines by the end of this year. The government of Japan is effective with the guidelines elaborating the supplementary requirements to effectively ensure that an WS mission with Japan's license is carried out responsibly as a lawful business conduct. Thank you. This is the end of my briefing.
Okay, terrific. You finished. Thank you so much. You finished in time for any questions. I have one. I wonder if, and we've got a couple of questions from the participants. So first, my question is, what are the, say, the 2 or 3 most significant challenges, problems, but challenges as you see them in international cooperation on the kinds of topics that you were bringing up? Where might these stumbling blocks be?
So challenges during what? During making guidelines or challenges during the operation?
Or any of those, but your choice.
Oh, so what is difficult is say WS on servicing is not very familiar to those stakeholders or spacecraft operators or space industry people, except WS related people. So many people in the Japanese space industry know there is area of WS. However, they are not familiar with details of detailed concept of WS. So therefore, now we are conferring with them to make these requirements official. However, some comments or questions from those people is so not necessarily easy to handle because so they are not very familiar with WS.
Right. No, that makes sense. Well, thank you so much. We're just about run out of time. Thank you for taking the time. It's getting pretty late in Japan. So it was really very kind of you to join us.